In this video, we're going to review the competing pathway analysis model, talk about moving from functional assessment to developing interventions. And we're going to focus on alternative behaviors specifically. We'll talk about the process of selecting an alternative behavior, and then we'll walk through something called an efficiency analysis. An efficiency analysis is something that is not critical for every intervention, but sometimes it can be an important piece to help us understand why an intervention isn't working. For selecting behaviors, we can review the competing behavior analysis model. The competing pathway model that we've discussed already has been around for a long time. It goes back to the early 90s, but most people can trace it back to an article by Sagai, Lewis Palmer, and Hagen in '98, and they described using this model to develop as part of the plan for developing interventions. The main idea is that you start out with a hypothesis statement, and you diagram that statement. You look at your challenging behavior, what are the antecedents that set the occasion for the behavior, what's the maintaining consequence that reinforces the behavior, and are there any setting events present? Then you identify two types of appropriate behaviors. You determine if there is an acceptable alternative or replacement behavior that can serve the same purpose or function as the challenging behavior, and you teach that to the student. At the same time, you determine what is it you really want the student to do in the situation in which the problem behavior occurs. And from this point, we can start looking at developing some kind of intervention. So in this example, we have a refusal behavior. The student's pushing materials off his desk and verbally refusing in order to escape work packets. So we can look at an alternative or replacement behavior a couple of different ways. We can look at it as a separate skill to teach the student to obtain whatever he or she's after, but through the problem behavior. For example, with young children with autism, I often used to teach communication skills. So I would look at if the behaviors serve the purpose of obtaining attention, I would teach the student to request attention. You can also look at a replacement behavior as an intermediate step towards the goal behavior, and that's what we have in this example. Our goal behavior is for the student to complete 80% of the work without any problems. We're nowhere near there at this point, so an intermediate step might be to complete 2 items and then get a break. So we can expand the model to show that the replacement behavior might result in a different reinforcer. So instead of escaping the task, it would result in a short break. This model is useful, as we've already discussed, to help you visualize how the behavior is already being reinforced. If we want a new behavior to be maintained, we actually have to compete with the reinforcement the student's getting for the challenging behavior. This is a concept that people don't often understand, and I find it very useful to chart this and use these diagrams to plan interventions in this way. You can also see at this point we've already started looking at antecedents that we might modify. So instead of the large packet, we can use a shortened packet. If there's a setting event involved, sometimes having a routine, or a neutralizing routine as it's sometimes called, can negate some of the effects of a setting event. When I worked with kids with emotional and behavioral disorders, I would often keep some different jobs around for the morning. And if I had a student that would come in already agitated, I would give them something repetitive to do that didn't require a lot of concentration, but it was just a way to help, and sometimes it would get them refocused on being at school. I would just keep a few things around that I could always pull out really quickly if I needed to. In this example, we're just getting the kid to do some kind of physical activity before getting in to do work. Sometimes that helps, sometimes it doesn't. Uh, Setting events are very individualized. When we consider a replacement behavior, there are two concepts we have to keep in mind. One is something called functional equivalency, and the other is something called response efficiency. And we'll talk about each of these. Functional equivalency means that we have identified another behavior that in effect serves the same purpose or leads to the same outcome that the challenging behavior used to. So it's something that is acceptable, and we can teach the student to do it instead of the challenging behavior. If we can identify something that would be acceptable, this is always a good thing to teach. We'll look at some other examples later on where it's not always the case. Sometimes we can't find an equivalent behavior. That's when we might teach a replacement behavior that's an intermediate step towards the desired behavior. Response efficiency has to do with the amount of effort that goes into a behavior before it gets reinforced. So a very efficient behavior is a behavior that gets a payoff very quickly. When we look at the size of a reinforcer, we look at the amount of reinforcement. Is it a lot versus a little bit? In other words, if we're teaching the student, let's look at this example. If a student is doing something to get adult attention, and we teach an alternative behavior, we teach the student to make appropriate related comments and ask questions. The reaction to that might be, very nice, thank you, just kind of a subdued response. However, if that kid is doing some really inappropriate behavior, sometimes that gets a very strong reaction. So the adult might respond by more contact, engaging in a long verbal exchange or reprimand. So there could be an issue with the amount of reinforcement and the quality of reinforcement. Also, the immediacy of reinforcement has a lot to do with how powerful a reinforcer is. Behaviors that result in a very quick payoff tend to be strengthened more than behaviors that result in something that's very delayed. So when we're planning on teaching a replacement behavior, we have to consider how quickly is the problem behavior reinforced, how much reinforcement is obtained, and what's the quality or intensity of that reinforcement. So when we do an intervention and we expect kids to work for very delayed reinforcers, sometimes that is not enough to compete with the kind of reinforcement they might get for engaging in a challenging behavior. There's some steps that we can go through to determine if something is really functionally equivalent. Step one is to do a functional behavior assessment. You have to determine the function of a challenging behavior. This seems sort of simplistic to say this, but I have seen people try to teach what they call are replacement behaviors when they're really not sure what the function of the challenging behavior was. So, for instance, if we're teaching a kid a replacement behavior of asking for help or assistance, and the real function of that behavior is to get peer attention, teaching that behavior is probably going to have no effect on the challenging behavior. So you have to start with a hypothesis statement that is obtained from some kind of functional behavior assessment. The next step is you consider if there is some kind of communicative alternative to the challenging behavior. In other words, is there an appropriate way for the person to ask for whatever that outcome was, whether it's teacher attention, escape from a demand, or peer attention. With peer attention, sometimes it may involve teaching a social skill, teaching the student some more appropriate way to get a response from peers. With young children or kids on the autism spectrum, sometimes we might even have to teach some kind of alternative form of communication. So some of you are familiar with the picture exchange communication system. That system for young kids or kids on the autism spectrum is very effective because it's very efficient. There's very little effort that goes into it, and the way it's taught usually results in a very immediate payoff. Once you teach that behavior, and we'll go through the steps of how you actually teach something later, then you have to be sure that you're reinforcing the communicative function. In other words, you're set up so that when this behavior does occur, you're reinforcing it and responding to it on a consistent basis. That's another reason why it's important to sometimes begin interventions in a shorter period of the day. So you're not going to try to do something all day long in the beginning, but you're going to target a time period in which you have more control and you can begin some of this instruction. Then once the student's successful, you can extend it into other periods of the day. When we talk about response efficiency, we're concerned with the rate or the amount of effort that has to go into a behavior. How hard is it for the person to engage in this replacement behavior versus the challenging behavior? An example here would be if you're teaching a student who has a lot of difficulty with social situations, some kind of social skill versus having a tantrum, the tantrum might be easier for the student in the beginning. So you have to consider if you're going to ask the person to do something more difficult, you have to be sure that the reinforcement is greater for the more difficult behavior. Another thing that relates to response efficiency is the rate of reinforcement. Or you could also talk of this in terms of schedule of reinforcement. How often is this behavior reinforced versus the challenging behavior? I once did an intervention for a gentleman in a group home. He was in a wheelchair, he was nonverbal, and he engaged in self-injurious behavior. He would hit himself in the head with his fist, and it served a communicative function. In other words, he would do this if he needed to get out of his wheelchair or if he wanted something to drink. He didn't have any other way to communicate. This was back a number of years ago. I did a functional behavior assessment, and I determined there were 3 different situations when he would do this, and then I developed a communication system so that he could point to pictures and make different kinds of requests. This intervention was really effective in the beginning, but over time I got a call from the group home again, and they said, we're still doing this intervention, but it's not working anymore. He's starting to hit himself. So I went in and observed in the morning. Everybody was getting ready, and I saw this young man make a request with a picture, and someone said, okay, I'll get to you in just a minute. And then they were working with some of the other folks. He made the request like 2 or 3 times, and they ignored him the second and third time. Then he started hitting himself in the head, and someone literally ran across the room to get to him and gave him what he was after. So this was very clear that the challenging behavior was being reinforced more than the alternative behavior. Also, it was probably reinforced more quickly. So it was, it was definitely the next item is the immediacy of reinforcement. How quickly does it get a reaction? And then the quality of reinforcement, as we discussed. The amount of reinforcement has to be at least equal, and if we can, we want to make it more powerful for the replacement behavior. This is tough sometimes because challenging behaviors get a big reaction from people. Response efficiency or behavioral efficiency is important because it plays a big part in determining which behavior a person engages in. if a person has two choices or two options, I can either hit myself in the head or I can point to a picture. I'm going to do the one that requires the least effort. Pointing to a picture hopefully would require a little less effort than hitting yourself, but if you have to point to a picture over and over again, that is less efficient. The rate of consequences has a big part to play in it. If I have two choices, I'm going to do the behavior that has the highest likelihood of paying off. If I have to do one behavior 10 times and another behavior 3 times to get a payoff, I'm going to do the behavior that gets paid off every third time. The quality of the consequence has something to do with it as well. If I'm going after something like attention from someone, I'm going to engage in the behavior that is going to give me the most attention. And then, of course, the immediacy of the consequence has a factor. The more immediate the consequence, the more powerful the reinforcer. All of these factors interact with each other. They're combined. Sometimes we don't have as big of an impact or as much control over something like, say, the quality of a reinforcer. We know that it's less likely that people are going to react as strongly to this appropriate behavior than they have been to the challenging behaviors. Then we have to make up for it with the other concepts. We have to be sure that we have very immediate reinforcement, that it's reinforced on a very consistent schedule, and that the behavior we're asking the person to do doesn't require a lot of effort. So, and same thing, if we can't control the amount of effort, if the behavior is going to require more effort, then we have to be sure that it's reinforced consistently and immediately, and the quality of the reinforcer is really high. So, how do we ensure that the alternative behavior we're going to teach is going to be more efficient than the challenging behavior? One of the steps I go through is I do a behavior efficiency analysis. Now, I'll warn you, this is not something that everyone does, and it's actually something that a lot of people have never heard of. However, I think it's a big reason that some interventions are effective and some are not. So I want to teach you to go through this process. It may not be something that you formally do every time, but hopefully this will teach you a way of thinking about replacement behaviors that will guide you in developing your intervention plans. I actually do use this matrix when I develop interventions, and I find it very helpful for me and also as a way to communicate with the team members with whom I'm working. You begin by looking at the challenging behavior. And if you've done a functional behavior assessment, you have all the information that you would include in these cells. So whatever the challenging behavior is, I write down the amount of effort. So I may just describe how much effort is involved in this behavior and just use some descriptive terms like, it doesn't require a lot of effort, or it's pretty minimal, and I may just describe the behavior here. Then I include the rate of the consequence. Well, again, if you have observational data, you can do this because you know about how many times this behavior occurs before it gets paid off. Then you make a comment about the immediacy of the consequence. And these don't have to be exact numbers. You can say, on average, someone seems to respond to this behavior after about 30 seconds or after about 5 minutes. Just on average, what does it seem to be? And then what's the quality of the consequence? For example, if it's a behavior that is maintained by adult attention, then the quality of the consequence I would describe, someone will get in his face and then loudly give him a reprimand, or it could be, something more subdued. So you just describe how much reinforcement and what's the quality of it. So that gives you a picture of what's happening right now. What is the efficiency of this challenging behavior? And you're describing it in those 4 cells in that column. The next thing we look at is the desired behavior. What is it we ultimately would like the student to do in the situation in which the problem behavior occurs. Often this is going to be something that is requiring the student to do something for very delayed reinforcement. For example, we may expect the student to complete, work for 30 minutes before taking a break, or, complete a task and then do something with a peer. So it may be very delayed. So let's write out in these cells, think about what it is we really are expecting the student to do ultimately, and then describe it in terms of the amount of effort, which may be considerable compared to the challenging behavior, the rate of the consequence that we expect the person to work towards. Usually this is very delayed reinforcement, and the person may have to engage in the behavior for a while. So rate of consequence and immediacy are related. Rate is more with schedule. Immediacy is how long between the behavior being emitted or finished and then the person getting the payoff. Sometimes that's delayed. With typical class-wide reinforcement systems, we might expect a kid to go the entire day or sometimes several days without getting some kind of payoff. There's a problem, though, when we expect that of a student when he or she's not ready. So by just being honest and putting it down on this form, it lets us compare these two side by side. And the same thing with the quality of the consequence. What's the quality of what we're expecting the student to be willing to work for? When we look at these two columns, we generally see a real inequality there. We see how the challenging behavior is getting paid off more immediately. It has a richer schedule of reinforcement, and then sometimes the quality of the reinforcement's higher. So it's not surprising why the kid's actually doing the challenging behavior instead of this goal behavior. So to get us there, we sometimes teach an intermediate behavior, or we're going to call it the efficient behavior, because it's designed to compete more directly with the challenging behavior. It may be doing less of a task or getting more immediate reinforcement. Remember in the previous slides we talked about how sometimes we have control over some aspect of efficiency and not others. Putting it on this chart lets us look at it very directly, and we can determine, for example, if we don't have much control over effort, we really have to beef up the rate of reinforcement or the immediacy of reinforcement. Let's look at an example. It should be a little clearer. Let's say that the challenging behavior is our student talks out or tears up worksheets when presented with a difficult task. The goal behavior, what we'd actually like the student to do, is complete all of the work. Let's compare the efficiency of these two. Well, the amount of effort tearing up the worksheets is already something this person can do. When it's a behavior that someone has learned and practiced, we say that it's in that person's repertoire. If we look at our expectation of completing all the work, we see that our student's never actually done that. I often see people develop behavioral interventions, and their first step is to reinforce a student for doing something that she or he has never actually done. That intervention is doomed to fail before it's even implemented. It simply isn't going to happen. Any kind of behavior change plan has to begin at the point where the student currently is. So, an intermediate behavior, or a more efficient one, might be have the person do a few parts of the task or segments of the task, or give them another way of responding. For example, if the person has difficulty with paper and pencil, have them do some responses verbally, or have them do something on a keyboard, let them circle items versus writing items, do a combination of things. So we can either change the amount of effort that goes into it or the amount of work that has to be done to make it more efficient. If we look at the rate of consequence, we see that right now, 75 to 100% of the time, the person's actually escaping the task. And the goal is to have the person complete everything before escaping. In order for the intervention to be successful, we might have to initially arrange for the student to escape the task by asking for a break. When we teach a student to ask for a break, initially we have to be sure that it happens immediately. So when I used to work with young kids with autism who had severe challenging behavior, I would start to teach them a communication skill at a time that I knew I could immediately reinforce it. So sometimes we have to begin this kind of instruction, again, just for certain periods of the day. We can introduce delays later, and ultimately we want the person to delay reinforcement, but in the beginning we might have to provide access to something immediately if it's going to compete with the challenging behavior. Also, consider the quality of reinforcement. Ultimately, we would like the student to begin a new task once one has been finished, but we have to compete with this challenging behavior of escaping a task completely, so maybe allowing a brief period of escape before the next task would be an intermediate point. Once we selected an alternative behavior, we have to consider why the student isn't already doing this behavior. It helps to consider if the lack of performance is due to a skill deficit or a performance deficit. A skill deficit has to do with whether or not the student actually knows the behavior, whether the person has that skill. Sometimes a person just simply doesn't know that this behavior is not acceptable. And maybe the student has learned just from experience this behavior has been reinforced, and the student simply is not aware that this is not an acceptable form of behavior. When I used to work with young children with autism, sometimes children had learned a certain way to communicate things that was not appropriate. One young man with whom I worked, if he needed to go to the bathroom, he would just hold himself and make a noise, grunt, and that got him some very strange looks when we went out into the community and we were in a Walmart, and he walked up to a person that worked there and held himself in the crotch and went, "Ah!" And that was not a good day. So we had to work on teaching him some more appropriate ways to ask to use the restroom. In his case, he wasn't trying to get the lady's attention for any inappropriate reason. He was genuinely making a request, but that was the only way he knew. Sometimes the frequency of an appropriate skill is there, but it's just really, really low. So the person maybe does it sometimes, but hasn't done it enough that it's actually become a skill that they use. So if we're dealing with a skill deficit, the first thing we do is we have to teach the new behavior. If it's a performance deficit, then it's an issue with motivation. Sometimes a person does actually know the skill, but just doesn't use it consistently. This often happens with kids with emotional and behavioral disorders. Sometimes people will say, well, no, he has this skill, he can do it. But the issue is the person just isn't doing it. Like the person may, if you put them in a role play situation, the kid may be able to tell you the proper thing to say, but in real life, in real peer interactions, the person doesn't use that skill. Sometimes it's an issue of the person not knowing when to use a certain skill. So they have a set of behaviors, but they have not learned the proper cues that should signal the use of those behaviors in the real world. An example here would be kids with Asperger's syndrome that may have some isolated social skills, but they're dependent on someone else prompting them as to when to use those skills. So in this case, we need to actually teach the person the cues to respond to. And sometimes it's simply an issue of reinforcement. The inappropriate behavior gets reinforced more quickly, or the quality of the reinforcement's greater, or the schedule of the reinforcement's greater. So it's an issue of response efficiency that we were just talking about, where the reinforcement for the problem behavior is greater than the reinforcement for the appropriate behavior. So the challenging behavior is the one that actually happens. So if it's a skill deficit, we focus on instruction and then reinforcing the new skill. If it's a performance deficit, we focus on eliminating as much reinforcement for the problem behavior as possible and strengthening the amount of reinforcement the student gets for the alternative behavior. Sometimes it also involves teaching the cues by which the person is cued to engage in the appropriate behavior. It's extremely important to determine if a deficit in the replacement behavior is due to a skill deficit or a performance deficit, because that will determine the nature of the intervention you develop. If it's a skill deficit, often we'll need to take the skill and break it down into smaller steps or do a task analysis. For example, if we're talking about a social skill, we may break it down into 5 steps. The first step might be, to engage in eye contact. If we were teaching, say, for instance, problem-solving skill to a young kid with emotional and behavioral disorders, we might teach them active listening. We might teach them to restate what the other person said and consider some alternatives, and then tell the person why you're choosing this alternative or that alternative. So we break it down into steps, and then we actually have to model the skill. This is more effective if we do it in situations where the student's actually going to use the skill. When I was working with young kids with emotional and behavioral disorders, we would work on these skills every day. But I would model problem-solving skills, and I would take another student and model the skill, or I would work with a teaching assistant. And then I would verbally describe what I was doing. So I sort of think out loud. Sometimes giving verbal explanations can help. If you're working with younger kids or kids on the autism spectrum, you want to minimize the kind of verbal explanations you give. That can make things more confusing. Once you've modeled a skill, students need to immediately have the opportunity to practice it. So you have them practice it with a peer, and then you give them feedback on their performance. You tell them what they did well first, and then you offer some suggestions as to how to make it better, and I would have them do that part again. When someone is learning a new skill, no matter what it is, you need to provide very frequent reinforcement. This is how learning is going to happen more quickly, and the likelihood that this skill is going to replace a problem behavior is much greater if it results in very immediate reinforcement. We'll talk some more later in the course about these different aspects of teaching these skills and how to do them more effectively, but these are the basic strategies that we're going to use in any kind of situation. If we're dealing with a performance deficit, we have to look at the amount of reinforcement that the student is getting for the challenging behavior, and we have to eliminate as much of that as possible. That gets right back to response efficiency. The person is simply going to do the behavior that results in the most immediate and higher quality of reinforcement. So by things like developing a behavioral contract or using some kind of systematic reinforcement system, or using the PREMAC principle. Just as a review, the PREMAC principle is simply using one behavior to reinforce another. So a student's going to do something that's less preferred if he or she can have access to something that is more highly preferred later on. Sometimes we might have to use some reductive consequences. There are appropriate ways to use them, and there are inappropriate ways to use them, and we'll talk about those later in the course. But sometimes for more severe problems, that is an important part of the intervention. And we're talking here about things like maybe response cost, briefly removing something the student has as a consequence of a behavior. An example would be with a young child, using a toy inappropriately, say taking a Nerf bat, hitting another kid with it. I would remove that toy for a period of time. That's a kind of response cost, saying, you're not using this appropriate, you have to put this away. With older kids, it might be, reducing or fining kids some points for certain behaviors. The problem with this is you don't want to get carried away with it. People do sometimes. You want any kind of reinforcement system to be primarily positive, and you want to focus on appropriate behaviors that you want to increase and not on reducing behaviors that you don't want to see. You're going to have the most long-term effect with your intervention plan if you focus on appropriate behaviors. Sometimes with performance deficit, it's a matter of the person not understanding the cues that should signal the behavior. In those situations, we're going to do something called discrimination training. We're going to teach the person what cues they need to pay attention to in the environment that would signal them when it's appropriate to do a certain behavior. That's an important part of social skills that often doesn't get taught. We'll teach isolated skills, but unless we teach the natural cues that someone needs to respond to, that person is not going to become independent using the skill. Sometimes we have to look at the antecedents or the setting events, and we have to make changes there. So we have to change antecedents that are triggering the behavior so that it's less likely that behavior is going to occur. And sometimes we'll do this at the same time we're doing other interventions. The goal with any intervention is to eventually eliminate it so that the student is just engaging in appropriate behavior without artificial support. So whatever supports we put in place, we need a plan for how we're going to fade those out over time. Remember that behavior occurs for a reason. Anytime we identify a behavior that we're going to decrease, we need to identify an appropriate behavior that we're going to increase. Hopefully we're going to identify a behavior that will serve the same purpose as the challenging behavior. Once we've identified a replacement behavior, we have to look at antecedent intervention procedures that we're going to use at the same time. It's important that we take a proactive approach to intervening with problem behavior and not a reactive approach. In other words, what we do before a problem happens is extremely important. And that's a concept that a lot of people don't understand. People think of interventions as always being a way that you react to a problem behavior once it's occurred. When we're dealing with alternative behaviors, we have to look for opportunities to prompt the student to use the new skill in situations where the student has engaged in the challenging behavior. What we're doing here is we're disrupting the connection between the antecedent, the challenging behavior, and the consequence. We're prompting the student to do a different behavior that will result in reinforcement rather than the challenging behavior. So it's important sometimes to plan teaching opportunities, and later on we'll look at a model for doing that. If we're going to teach something like a communication skill, let's say we're going to teach a student to request a break, we can practice that outside of a difficult task, but if we want the student to use that skill, we're going to have to prompt the student to ask for a break in the middle of some kind of difficult task that student is motivated to escape. What you want to be very careful that you do, however, is not have the student engage in the challenging behavior and then prompt them to do the alternative behavior. What you're actually teaching then is a chain of behaviors that includes first engaging in the problem behavior and then doing the alternative behavior and getting reinforced. So it's important to control teaching opportunities so that you're prompting the student to do the alternative behavior first. So let's take Tom as an example of an alternative communication behavior that we want to teach. Tom gets frustrated with math, so after he works a few problems, he stops and he annoys peers. He talks to them, takes items off their desk. The function of this is to briefly escape the work. An alternative or intermediate behavior would be to have Tom ask for a short break before he completed more problems. A couple of other examples. Beth wants to interact with peers, but she has a lot of difficulty with expressive communication. So she does some inappropriate things in order to get a reaction from them. An alternative set of behaviors for her would be to learn to appropriately initiate social interactions or teach initiation skills. Billy, on the other hand, will run up to the teacher at times when other kids make requests for help or want to say something else to the teacher. So he's trying to get the teacher's attention, so teaching him a more appropriate way to get attention or to start an interaction with a peer or an adult would be an alternative behavior. So if you're going to teach a communication skill as an alternative behavior, the first step, determine the function of the challenging behavior. Then you choose a communicative alternative that serves the same function or purpose as the challenging behavior. Ideally, this is something that is easy for the student to do or something that's in the student's repertoire of skills. If it isn't, then this is something you would have to teach. And then finally, you have to reinforce this behavior when it occurs. You may also have to prompt the student to engage in this behavior at times when he or she typically is engaged in the problem behavior. You have to also carefully consider the two concepts we discussed earlier, functional equivalency and response efficiency. Is the communicative skill that you want to teach, does it serve the same function or serve the same purpose as the challenging behavior? And in terms of response efficiency, does it result in reinforcement quicker or more easily or better than the challenging behavior? If it doesn't, you're going to have to beef up some of these aspects of response efficiency. Again, you can't always control all of them, but if you have one that does not compete successfully with the challenging behavior, you have to make the others work better. In terms of a communication skill, you also have to consider whether or not something is socially acceptable. Is this skill going to be considered appropriate in the community or in situations where the student's going to need to use it? For example, the kid earlier that I told you about that would hold himself when he needed to go to the restroom, that was very explicit. It was very clear what he wanted, and he could produce that very quickly. So it certainly could be done with speed. It was very intelligible, but it was socially unacceptable for a child his age to be doing that. So we needed to teach him a different skill. Ultimately, no intervention is going to be effective if it is not consistently implemented with fidelity. So you have to consider the people who are going to be implementing the intervention. It's always best if the people who are going to be responsible for carrying out the intervention are involved in developing it and have input into the strategies that are used. It's not very effective just to give an intervention to a group of people and with the instructions just to follow it. It's very likely that people will not take ownership of it. So these are aspects of an intervention that it's helpful to consider. Is the intervention going to significantly change what the interventionist usually does? To what extent will it impact that person's routine? If it does substantially change what that person's going to do, is the person on board? And how much will it impact other things more indirectly, like instruction for other students? Changes should be made so that it's going to disrupt the routine as little as possible. To what extent does the intervention agree with that person's style of teaching or with interacting with others. How much time is it going to take? What to what extent are things like arranging antecedents or providing consequences going to be appropriate for that classroom or that person? A guideline that I've always used is I try to determine whether it was me or someone I was helping, how much time I spent dealing with a challenging behavior. How much of my time did I spend redirecting a student or calming a student down, collecting some kind of data, or offering alternatives to a student. And I took that amount of time and I compared it to how much time I expected to spend on an intervention over the period of several weeks or several months. If it was clear that I was going to be spending a lot more time on this intervention than I was dealing with the challenging behavior, that usually was an indication that that plan was too complex. So I would start to change things to make it more acceptable. It's important when you offer alternatives to someone or when you're making decisions for yourself that you make decisions that are focused on the function of the behavior. The plans that we implement are usually going to involve changing the activity, changing the duration of what we do, sometimes teaching the student to tolerate delays, or sometimes rearranging the environment. When we make these changes, it's more likely they're going to have the desired effect if we consider the reason the problem behavior is happening to begin with.